Chapter 5 The Sands. A petite young woman dressed in a floral linen robe over hospital pajamas stood in her room staring vacantly out the window. She had tight, curly black hair cut into a short pixie, piercing dark green eyes, thin, bow-shaped lips, a perfectly shaped nose, and light caramel brown skin now deficient of pigmentation. Her disposition lacked maturity and poise, and her tiny, underdeveloped build appeared childlike. However, the slightest sign of age was apparent on her face, and she was void of any emotion. The walls of the room were constructed of large, light gray concrete blocks and looked as cold and dreary as the rainy Midwestern weather outside. A twin bed with a metal headboard was to the left of the window facing the door, neatly made with a white sheet folded over a dark gray wool blanket and a single white pillow. An old burnt orange leather suitcase covered with stickers from the cities of the world lay open on the bed, although the young woman had never visited any of those places. Inside the suitcase were a few articles of clothing, undergarments, socks, and one pair of shoes. There was a small desk and wooden chair bolted to the floor on the right side of the window, with dozens of black and white journal notebooks stacked neatly on top of it next to a pile of drawings. "It's time," a nurse said, coming through the door accompanied by a psych tech who carried a pair of padded handcuffs. The young woman turned around slowly, walked over to the nurse, and calmly held out her delicate hands. The trio then walked down a long hallway corridor with black and white checkered flooring and mind-numbing fluorescent lights. They proceeded through a security station and entered an elevator on the other side. When the elevator door opened on the first floor, they were greeted by two armed bailiffs in crisp olive green uniforms. The bailiffs took the young woman into custody, escorted her into a state of Illinois mental health court, and sat her in front of a panel of several psychiatric doctors, social workers, and a judge. The room was silent as the judge flipped through the stacks of paperwork each doctor individually handed to him. It felt like hours before he cleared his throat and addressed the young woman in handcuffs who sat quietly before him. "Gabriella Jackson, 25 years old," he said. "You were remanded to this psychiatric hospital 5 years ago and are here today to discuss the terms of your release. Due to your recurrent hallucinations, combative behavior, and complete disregard for superior rules and regulations, it would be my recommendation, as was recommended by your attending physicians, that your stay here be extended indefinitely. Despite that disturbing fact, forces greater than myself have negotiated your immediate release. Therefore, you are free to go. I pray God watches over your soul." He pounded down hard with his gavel to seal what was for Gabriella a long-awaited judgment. The doctors who had protested her release cringed in their seats when a bailiff removed her handcuffs, and she smiled victoriously. Madeline sat patiently in the lobby outside the office of Dr. Arthur Garrison, M.D., Ph.D. She was deep in thought, considering the possible repercussions attached to refusing Dr. Field's invitation to the gala. She had no intention of going with him. Apart from being absolutely repulsed by the idea to begin with, she already had enough trouble with the bevy of female nurses who already hated her and resented working under a younger woman. Publicly flaunting at the gala what they would surely perceive as a sexual relationship with their boss would only escalate their contempt. Many women at NOSPH and throughout New Orleans society in general considered Dr. Fields to be a top bachelor, and countless had attempted to seduce him after his divorce. Not only was he from excellent pedigree, but his social status alone would catapult even the lowliest ladder climber to the top of the register. His ex-wife was a younger, beautiful, well-known psychiatrist and a born and raised New Orleans medical socialite. And nobody wanted to replace Dr. Angelica Fields more than Nurse Sherry Monroe, whom Angelica had gone to school with and known most of her life. However, to Nurse Monroe's disappointment and disgust, it was Madeline, not she, who was to be Dr. Field's coveted prize. A fact known to all who'd witnessed the obsessively flamboyant affection he showed to Madeline, which he made no particular effort to hide. He regularly overlooked her frequently occurring and widely reported inadequacies, and blatantly showered her with compliments at every opportunity, but only in public. Privately, he liked to keep her on guard and under his control. Administrator Hamilton had warned Dr. Fields about his behavior multiple times, which he had impolitely disregarded. As far as he was concerned, he was his own boss, and Administrator Hamilton was a figurehead who wore her title by default. It was getting late, and after a long and tedious workday, Madeline was ready to go home. She had managed to avoid 3 weeks of her therapy sessions without reprimand and wasn't looking forward to a forced return. To maintain anonymity, she always made her appointments for the last hour on Dr. Garrison's schedule, and his floor was empty save a janitor and administrative secretary closing down for the day. Contrary to Dr. Field's earlier statement, Dr. Garrison's office wasn't only 2 floors up. It was across the emergency entrance driveway in an adjoining wing with minimal security on the 6th floor, while Dr. Fields and Madeline's office was on the 4th. And aside from both departments sharing the same janitorial team, they had absolutely nothing in common. Dr. Garrison's division consisted of psychiatrists who handled outpatient adult psychotherapy cases mandated by the state. His patients included anything from officers of the law required to use their weapons in the line of duty to state employees avoiding legal action for disciplinary offenses. And then there was Madeline. Dr. Fields had informed Madeline upon hire that she was required to undergo therapy because he believed all psychiatrists needed to take advantage of the mental health resources available to them, and that usually the reason new psychiatrists initially chose to enter the field was because of a personal or family history of mental illness or abuse. Being a man of incredible psychoanalytic ability, Dr. Fields had easily recognized such traits in Madeline and had given her no choice in the matter. She had been seeing Dr. Garrison monthly since her residency began, but had since been required to see him twice a week for the past 6 months, and wasn't particularly keen on the arrangement. She didn't want anyone knowing about her past and took creative measures to hide the truth about it. Nevertheless, clever psychiatrists have a way of getting even their most stubborn patients to talk, and Dr. Garrison was no exception. "Hello, Madeline," Dr. Garrison said, startling her. "Sorry to keep you waiting. Come on in." Madeline stood up and walked into his office without speaking. He closed the door, took a seat in a large brown leather wingback chair, and kicked his feet up on the matching ottoman in front of it. Madeline made her way to a long, mustard-colored suede sofa adjacent to him and stretched out her legs. Dr. Garrison was a short, plump man in his mid-60s with pale skin and rosy cheeks. Bald on top with a wreath of bushy gray hair on the sides, he wore a daily uniform of round tortoiseshell glasses and a multicolored argyle sweater vest. His office was scholarly and traditional, with dark cherrywood paneled walls and rows of shelves filled with medical, psychological, and theological books he often suggested for home reading. Behind his large, antique, glass-topped oak desk and leather swivel chair was a window covered with heavy twill drapes he kept closed during all sessions to create a dark library den effect. He was a simple man who had no plans for retirement, as long as his health and patience allowed him to continue with his practice. "It's been a long time, young lady," he said. "I'm not usually accustomed to placing calls to my patients' supervisors, but you left me no alternative." "Well," Madeline replied, I'm sure Dr. Fields enjoyed the opportunity to solicit you for information about my progress, so no harm done. You need to return my calls, Madeline. These are still mandatory sessions, and you need to stay in compliance. I'm here to help you. And you know perfectly well this is all confidential. How have you been feeling lately? Pretty much the same, I guess. Any side effects from the new dosage? No, my transition's fine. Did you transition, or have you decided to supplement with other methods of self-medication? I'm taking my meds. She hadn't taken her medication since the last time she saw him. It wasn't helping anyway. It was making her symptoms worse. Dr. Garrison decided to switch topics. Madeline's medication had always been an uncomfortable subject, and he didn't want to continue to pry about it if he expected to make some degree of progress. When we left off last time, he said, you had begun to tell me about a series of recurrent nightmares from your childhood. Madeline felt the anxiety surging up in the back of her neck. This was the line of questioning she knew he would push, which she'd been dreading. They weren't only nightmares from her childhood. They had been plaguing her every night of her life as long as she could remember, and increasing in severity over the past 6 months. Yes, she said, apprehensively. The nightmares where I was trapped in hell, with his presence pulling me toward him, night after night. Who was pulling you toward him, Madeline? Satan. Dr. Garrison sat up slightly in his chair. Madeline had mentioned experiences involving Satan during her last appointment. However, he had concluded her portrayal must have been a religious superstition, or perhaps based on imagery she was using to suppress horrific memories she was unable to explain. He knew they were making headway and wasn't surprised when he didn't see her again for their next session, and had intentionally given her space before calling her back in. How did you know it was Satan? He asked. I can't explain it. It's something you just know. I need you to try, Madeline. Can you describe the dream for me? Madeline's muscles tensed and her chest tightened. A warm flush washed over her body. It became harder to breathe, and a familiar sense of fright began to take over. It's like being engulfed in a sandstorm, she began. There's sand swirling all around, stinging your face and burning your eyes, and never-ending dunes blending in with the sky. There is no sky. You search for the exit, but there's no way out, and you can't feel or see anything except fear and him. What is the worst dream you can remember? How old were you? The contents of Madeline's memory she desperately tried to hide and forget fully resurfaced, and the words poured uncontrollably from her mouth. I was 8, she said, her tone rising from a whisper to a cry. When I woke up, I was lingering somewhere between the dream world and reality. It was like I was stuck inside my wall, paralyzed. The sands were all around me, but I somehow knew I was still in my bedroom. I could see the other side. My body was completely inverted upside down against the wall. I was kicking and screaming, trying to escape and get back into my bed, begging for my mother to help. But she was just standing there in the doorway, staring at me. What about your father, Madeline? Did anyone else in the house see what was happening to you? Madeline lay quietly for a moment, remembering. Yes, my sister, Gabriella. She was there too. She just stood there in the doorway next to our mother. Neither of them did anything. They just lingered there, expressionless, just staring at me. As Madeline walked to her car, her depressive state plummeted further than before. Every time she submitted to a session with Dr. Garrison, she found herself dangerously exposed. She hated talking about her biological family, but in therapy it was unavoidable. Her history with them had defined the current circumstances of her life. She was sick from the stress and needed to get home as fast as possible, mix a drink, and erase the filth of the day. Driving home, Madeline couldn't shake the debilitating anxiety she'd felt while explaining the details of her nightmare to Dr. Garrison. She'd never divulged her experiences to anyone outside her family and had an ominous feeling about the consequences of making such an amateur mistake. Lately, the dreams were getting more frightening and vivid in nature and spilling over into the day. She knew something in her world had shifted, yet couldn't decipher what had changed or why. But she knew releasing the details verbally to a third party was sure to result in another increase in the magnitude of her dream's severity. She turned onto Interstate 10 and headed back to the quarter. As cars sped by on the congested 5-lane freeway, her heart began to pound harder and louder until a painful ringing erupted in her ears and her vision blurred. A massive sandstorm tornado appeared in the road ahead, engulfing her car and blinding her view. She couldn't see anything in front or to the sides and checked the rearview mirror, but saw nothing except clean glass, not even her own reflection. The cars once occupying the packed freeway had disappeared, and a whiteout of never-ending sand blasted her car. Suddenly, the ringing in her ears turned to a grainy, screeching howl. Her blood pumped excruciatingly through her veins, and she couldn't catch her breath. The form of Satan appeared in the middle of the road ahead, disappeared, and then reappeared, blocking her way. She tried to scream and slammed on the brakes as her car approached, but no sound came out, and the pedal hit the floor with no reaction. She swerved evasively to avoid the terrifying image in front of her and skidded off the embankment, gasping for air. After the car jerked to a halt, she tucked her chin into her chest and put her arms over her head, sweat dripping from her brow and blood still pulsing. When the screeching subsided, she looked up. The sands had cleared, and the city buildings had reappeared with lights glowing in the night as usual. She found herself turned around on the edge of an off-ramp with cars whipping by once again, honking at her as they passed. She instinctively searched for her emergency flask of vodka, dug it up from deep underneath the passenger seat, took a long, hard swig, then got back on the road. When Madeline arrived at her apartment in the bustling French Quarter, hot tears streamed down her face. "I'm going crazy," she thought, petrified and shaken. She parked in her reserved space in the lot across the street, looked over, and saw Gabriella standing motionless on the steps to her building with 2 bags of luggage, just staring at her.